By the time Ruby Clay sat in front of the judge, nobody in Cedar Hollow was asking who had failed her anymore. They only remembered who she had destroyed. 2 people were dead because of what happened inside Linda Harlan's small white house at the end of Briar Creek Road. Linda, the retired school bus driver who had given Ruby a clean bedroom when no one else wanted her. Mark Harlan, Linda's grown son, who had begged his mother not to let Ruby stay. And Grace Harlan, Mark's 9-year-old daughter, was still alive. But after that night, people in Cedar Hollow stopped saying she had been lucky, because survival is not the same as being spared. Even Blue, Linda's old dog, became part of the story people spoke about in lowered voices. Not because his life mattered more than the human lives that were lost, but because Blue had once been the first living thing in that house Ruby trusted enough to hold. That was the part Cedar Hollow could not forgive. Ruby had not destroyed the home of strangers. She had destroyed the only place that had ever tried to make room for her. The prosecutor called her manipulative, dangerous, empty where remorse should have been. A woman who took pity, turned it into power, and then punished the people who finally saw through her. And maybe the worst part was that Ruby had heard those words before. Liar, trouble, dangerous, damaged. Long before the courtroom, long before the police lights outside Linda's house, long before Cedar Hollow learned to fear her name, Ruby Clay had been a skinny little girl standing in a school hallway, trying to tell the truth to adults who had already decided she was making it up. Back then, she was not asking for forgiveness. She was asking to be believed. But pain does not make a person innocent forever, and being broken by the world does not give anyone the right to break someone else. So the question was never whether Ruby Clay had suffered. She had. The real question was darker than that. How does a child who once begged someone to believe her grow into a woman who lies so well that she destroys the people who finally did? The courtroom in Cedar County was too small for what was lost. People stood at the back because there were not enough seats. Some had known Linda Harlan for 40 years. Some had worked beside Mark or waved to him after storms. Others came because tragedy turns quiet people into witnesses. Ruby Clay sat at the defense table with her hands folded in front of her. She did not look like the thing the newspapers had made her into. She looked smaller than that. Pale, tired. A woman in a borrowed blazer, hair pinned too tightly. No one in that room owed her softness. Not anymore. When the prosecutor stood, he did not begin with Ruby's childhood. He began with names. Linda Harlan, Mark Harlan, Grace Harlan. He said Linda's name like the town itself had lost a mother. He said Mark's name like a warning that had come too late. And when he said Grace's name, the room changed. Not because she had died, but because she had lived long enough to carry what Ruby left behind. Linda had not been careless with a stranger, he told them. She had been merciful to a woman she believed had never been given a fair chance. She had washed sheets for Ruby, cleared drawers for her, set an extra plate at dinner, handed her a key without asking for anything except honesty. Then he looked at Ruby and said that some betrayals were not born from hunger or fear. Some were chosen. Ruby lowered her eyes, but she did not cry. Her public defender tried to give the room another version. He spoke of a rented house near the tracks, thin walls, old welfare notes, school reports, a closed Child Protective Services file, and questions that should have been asked sooner. He said Ruby Clay had been failed before she ever learned how to fail others. For a moment, Ruby's face changed, not enough for the courtroom to forgive her, not enough to bring anyone back, but enough to show there was still a part of her that remembered being small. Because long before she sat beneath fluorescent lights in a courtroom, Ruby had stood beneath fluorescent lights in a school hallway. She was 9 years old then, thin in the way children get when nobody remembers breakfast. Her coat sleeves covered half her hands. Her shoes were damp from walking through the ditch, because the bus had dropped her too far from the house. Mrs. Evelyn Price found her near the office, staring at the floor tiles as if they might tell her what to say. Ruby had been in trouble that week. She had taken a pencil case from another girl's desk and sworn she had not. She had told the lunch aide her mother was sick, then told the nurse her mother was working. By the time she tried to tell the truth, the adults around her were already tired of sorting through her stories. "What happened at home, Ruby?" Mrs. Price asked gently. Ruby opened her mouth, and for one brief, dangerous second, she believed the truth might work. But children like Ruby learn early that adults do not listen to words alone. They listen to reputations, Clean clothes, packed lunches, mothers who answer phone calls, houses that look respectable from the road. Ruby had none of those things. What she had was a record of lying, a mother who could sound sober when she needed to, and a town that preferred messy children to be difficult rather than endangered. So when Ruby finally spoke, the truth came out small, too small to survive the room. By the next afternoon, Darlene Clay was telling the school Ruby had always been dramatic. Officer Bud Keene was saying some kids learned early how to get attention. A note was made, a call was placed, a file was opened just long enough to close, and Ruby went home. That was the day something inside her shifted. No one watching her would have seen a monster being made. They would have seen a little girl climbing the steps to a house she did not want to enter, learning a lesson no child should ever have to learn. If the truth could not save her, then maybe the truth was not sacred. And if people were going to call her a liar either way, Ruby would eventually learn to make the lie useful. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town people described by what it used to be. It used to have work. It used to have men coming home from the mines with black dust in the lines of their hands and money folded into their wallets on Fridays. It used to have a hardware store that stayed open late, a movie theater with one screen, and a diner where everybody knew which booth belonged to which family. By the time Ruby Clay was old enough to remember it, Cedar Hollow had become a place of closed windows and unpaid bills. The mine had cut jobs, then cut more, and the people left behind learned to make disappointment sound like weather. Just something that came through. Just something you endured. Ruby's house sat near the tracks, where freight trains passed slow enough to shake the glass in the kitchen cabinets. The rent was always late. The porch sagged on one side. In winter, towels were pushed against the bottom of the door to keep the wind out. In summer, the air smelled like damp carpet, cigarettes, and old cooking grease. Her mother, Darlene Clay, could be warm in short bursts. That was one of the things that made Ruby's childhood confusing. Darlene was not cruel every hour of every day. Some mornings, she would hum while making toast, call Ruby baby girl, and brush her hair with careful fingers. She would promise that things were about to get better. She would talk about leaving Cedar Hollow, getting a real place, maybe buying Ruby a purple bedspread she had seen once in a catalog. Ruby learned to love those mornings with a desperation that made her easy to disappoint. Because by evening, Darlene could become someone else. Tired, sharp, unreachable. A woman sitting at the kitchen table with a drink in front of her and bills spread out like accusations. If Ruby asked the wrong question, Darlene's face would close. If Ruby needed too much, Darlene would tell her not to start. So Ruby became good at kneading quietly. She learned which cabinets still had crackers. She learned how to pour cereal without milk. She learned that if she wore the same sweatshirt 3 days in a row, most teachers would not notice unless it smelled bad enough. She learned to wash herself at the sink when the water heater failed and to pretend she liked being alone. There were men, too. Not always the same one. Not always for long. Some were loud. Some were polite in public and different after the door closed. One of them, Ray Maddox, stayed longer than the others. He had a way of standing in a room that made Ruby feel as if she was taking up space he had not approved. No one ever explained to Ruby what kind of danger she was living near. Children are often expected to understand adult darkness without being given adult language. Ruby only knew the rules her body taught her. Do not make noise in the hallway. Do not ask where your mother is going. Do not correct a grown man when he says something untrue. Do not cry where someone can hear you. At school, the rules were different, but not easier. Ruby was not the kind of child teachers immediately felt sorry for. She did not always look fragile. Sometimes she was angry. Sometimes she lied badly and then lied harder when caught. She took food from other children's lunchboxes and said she had not. She told one teacher her mother was a nurse, another that her mother worked nights at the county office. She invented cousins, illnesses, family emergencies, anything that made the missing pieces of her life sound less humiliating. The other children noticed. They did not know enough to be merciful. They knew Ruby's clothes were wrong. They knew she smelled like smoke. They knew her mother missed meetings. They knew Ruby flinched when someone moved too fast, then got mean if anyone mentioned it. So they gave her names before they understood her. Weird, dirty, crazy, liar. Ruby collected those words the way other girls collected stickers. She did not want them, but they stuck to her anyway. Mrs. Evelyn Price was the first adult at school who looked past the behavior long enough to see fear underneath it. She taught fourth grade with a soft voice and tired eyes, the kind of teacher who kept granola bars in her bottom drawer because she had learned that some children could not listen while hungry. She began leaving one on Ruby's desk in the mornings without saying anything. At first, Ruby did not eat them. Kindness made her suspicious. A free thing was almost never free in her world, but hunger was stronger than pride. Eventually, she slipped the bars into her sleeve and ate them in the bathroom where nobody could watch her except help. Mrs. Price noticed other things. Ruby's sudden absences. The way she guarded her backpack. The stories that changed depending on who asked. The bruise-colored shadows under her eyes after weekends. None of it was proof by itself. That was the problem with children like Ruby. Their lives rarely arrived in clean evidence. They arrived in fragments. A smell, a silence, a sentence that stopped too quickly. Mrs. Price tried to gather the fragments into something adults would have to take seriously. She asked questions. She made notes. She spoke to the principal. The principal sighed, the way overworked people sigh when compassion has to compete with procedure. Then came the day Ruby said more than she meant to. It was not a dramatic confession. There was no perfect sentence that made the room understand. Ruby did not have the language for what was wrong. She only knew she did not want to go home while Ray's truck was in the driveway, and Darlene was not answering the phone. That should have been enough to slow the world down. Instead, the world asked for clarity. What exactly happened? When? Who saw? Why had she lied before? Ruby felt the questions closing around her. They were not cruel questions. Not all of them. But to a child already trained to hear disbelief before concern, they sounded like a door locking. Darlene came to the school wearing clean jeans and lipstick, smelling like peppermint gum. She looked embarrassed, then wounded, then angry in the quiet way that made other adults uncomfortable. She said Ruby had always had an imagination. She said Ruby had been acting out since her father left. She said she was doing her best and did not appreciate being treated like a criminal by people who saw her child only during school hours. Officer Budkeen arrived later. He knew Darlene from town. He knew the house from calls that never turned into charges. He spoke to Ruby like a man trying to finish paperwork before supper. You understand what happens when you make things up, don't you? Ruby remembered that sentence longer than she remembered his face. A call was made. A report was written. For a little while, Ruby's life became a folder on someone's desk. But Cedar Hollow had too many families in trouble and not enough people paid to care carefully. There was no clean proof. Darlene sounded convincing. Ruby had lied before. The file did not save her. Afterward, something changed in the way Ruby understood the world. Not all at once. Children do not become different in a single afternoon. They adjust quietly. They stop expecting certain doors to open. They learn which parts of themselves are unsafe to show. Ruby learned that truth was not judged by whether it happened. It was judged by whether the person telling it looked believable. And Ruby, with her dirty cuffs, changing stories, and frightened anger, did not. So she began to practice a different kind of survival. If adults wanted a simple story, she would give them one. If they wanted a sad child, she could become sad in the right way. If they wanted a bad child, she could be bad before they had the satisfaction of deciding it for her. Lying did not begin as power. For Ruby, it began as shelter. A small, ugly shelter. The only one she knew how to build. By the time Ruby turned 12, the house near the tracks had stopped pretending to be temporary. Darlene still talked about leaving Cedar Hollow. She talked about it the way some people talked about winning the lottery, with enough detail to make it sound almost possible. A better apartment, a better job, a school where no one knew Ruby's name, a town where every mistake did not follow you into the grocery store. But nothing changed except the bills on the kitchen table. The power went out twice that winter. The first time, Darlene made it feel like an adventure. She lit candles, wrapped Ruby in 2 coats, and told stories about how she used to sleep on her grandmother's porch during summer storms. Ruby almost believed they were a normal family doing something unusual, instead of a family running out of ways to hide how bad things had become. The second time, Darlene cried in the bathroom with the door locked. Ruby heard her through the wall and did not knock. That was another thing childhood had taught her. Some doors were not meant to be opened, even when the person behind them was hurting. Especially then. Ray Maddox was gone by spring, but he left behind the kind of silence that did not feel like peace. Darlene became harder to reach after that. She slept through mornings, missed appointments, forgot groceries, then woke up angry at the world for expecting anything from her. Ruby learned to keep a mental inventory of what they had left. Half a loaf of bread, 2 cans of soup, a jar of peanut butter with knife marks at the bottom. She also learned that hunger was easier to explain than loneliness. People understood hunger. Sometimes they even helped. Loneliness made them uncomfortable. When the school called again, Darlene did not come in lipstick and clean jeans. She came late, with her hair tied back too tightly and a face that looked older than it had the year before. There had been another absence, another argument, another small thing missing from a classroom shelf. Ruby sat outside the office and watched her mother talk through the glass. This time, Darlene did not defend her with fire. She looked tired enough to surrender. 2 weeks later, Ruby was sent to stay with her Aunt Mavis in a small house 3 towns over. Mavis Clay was Darlene's older sister, though the 2 women did not seem made from the same family. Mavis worked at a pharmacy, kept her receipts in envelopes, and owned a refrigerator covered with magnets from places she had never visited. Her house smelled like laundry soap and lemon cleaner. The couch had no stains. The bathroom had extra towels folded in a basket. For the first 3 nights, Ruby slept badly. The quiet was too complete. No trains shaking the cabinets. No strange men moving through the hallway. No Darlene crying behind a locked door. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a wall clock, and Mavis turning off lights before bed like a person who trusted morning to come. Ruby did not know what to do with that kind of safety. Mavis gave her rules, but they were simple ones. Be home after school. Put dishes in the sink. Tell the truth, even if it was ugly. Ruby hated that last one most. Not because it sounded cruel, because it sounded impossible. At first, things almost worked. Ruby started 8th grade in a place where no one knew the old stories. Mavis bought her 2 pairs of jeans and a winter coat from a discount store. She packed lunches in brown paper bags with Ruby's name written across the front. Not kiddo, not baby girl, her name. There were evenings when Ruby sat at Mavis's kitchen table doing homework while her aunt paid bills beside her. No one yelled. No one disappeared. No one asked Ruby to pretend everything was fine while the house fell apart around them. For a while, Ruby mistook the calm for a trap waiting to close. Then, slowly, she began to want it. That was what frightened her. Wanting made everything dangerous. If she wanted the clean towels, the packed lunches, the light left on over the stove, then losing them would not feel like moving again. It would feel like being stripped of something that had started to belong to her. Ruby had never been good at waiting for loss. One night, she heard Mavis on the phone with someone from the school. Mavis spoke quietly from the living room, but Ruby caught pieces. Paperwork. Long term. Darlene needs time. We have to see what's best. The words were not threatening. Not really. But Ruby did not hear them as adults trying to build a plan. She heard them as a meeting being held over her life without her permission. She heard drawers closing, bags being packed, another adult deciding where she would go next. The next morning, she began checking Mavis's purse. At first, she only looked. Then she counted. Then she took $5 and hid it under the lining of her backpack. A few days later, she took more. Not enough, she told herself, to really hurt anyone, just enough for a bus ticket, a motel room. Food if everything changed overnight. Ruby knew it was wrong. That mattered. She knew Mavis was not Darlene. She knew the money was not lying loose in a house where no one cared. It belonged to the woman who had bought her jeans, written her name on lunch bags, and waited up when she came home late from school. But fear can make theft sound like preparation. Ruby told herself she was not stealing from Mavis. She was protecting herself from the day Mavis stopped being kind. When Mavis found the money, she did not shout. That would have been easier for Ruby. Shouting gave her something to fight. Accusations gave her a wall to throw herself against. But Mavis only stood in the doorway of Ruby's room with the folded bills in her hand, looking less angry than wounded. "Ruby," she said, "I wanted to trust you." The sentence hit harder than a slap would have. Ruby felt shame rise so fast it became rage before she could recognize it. She said Mavis had probably been looking for a reason to send her back anyway. She said adults always acted sweet right before they changed their minds, She said she did not need anyone's charity. Mavis's face changed at that word. Charity. It was not what she had offered, but it was what Ruby could bear to call it. By the end of the week, Darlene came to pick her up. Mavis packed Ruby's clothes in a trash bag because there was no suitcase. She put the winter coat on top and tucked a $20 bill in one pocket without saying anything about it. Ruby found it halfway home. For a moment, she almost asked Darlene to turn the car around. She almost imagined walking back up Mavis's porch steps, handing over the money, and saying the words she had not been able to say when they mattered. I was scared. I'm sorry. Please don't give up on me. But Darlene was driving too fast, smoking with one hand, talking about how Mavis always thought she was better than everybody else. Ruby listened, touched the 20 in her coat pocket, and let the apology die inside her. It was easier to hate Mavis than to admit Mavis had tried. That was the lesson Ruby carried home. Not that people could not be kind. Something worse. People could be kind, and Ruby could still ruin it before they had the chance to prove whether they would stay. Ruby did not leave school with a fight. She simply stopped coming often enough for people to stop expecting her. First a day, then 3, then a week that turned into 2. By the time anyone used the word dropout, Ruby had learned that disappearing was easier when people had been preparing themselves to lose you. At 16, she moved through Cedar Hollow like a girl trying to pass as a woman. She knew how to count change under a counter, avoid certain men at gas stations, and make $12 last. But some part of her still waited for an adult to come looking. No one did. Darlene was still making promises. A new job, a better apartment, a chance to start over somewhere. Nobody knew them. Ruby had heard those promises so often they sounded like songs Darlene sang when ashamed. So Ruby found work where she could. She washed dishes at a diner until the owner's wife caught her taking rolls home in her coat pocket. She cleaned motel rooms along the county road, stripping sheets from beds where strangers left behind beer cans, loose change, and the smell of lives moving on. She stocked shelves at a dollar store, then quit after a manager asked why the address on her form did not match the one she gave over the phone. Every place got a different Ruby. At the diner, she was caring for a sick mother. At the motel, she was saving for community college. At the dollar store, she had an aunt in Charleston who wanted her as soon as she could afford the bus ticket. Some of it was true. Some had once been true. Some only felt true because Ruby needed it to be. She did not think of herself as dangerous. That would come later. Back then, she thought she was surviving. Her lies covered gaps in paperwork, food, and dignity. They made people stop asking before they reached the parts of her life that made her feel exposed. But every lie demanded another one, and Ruby was always tired. She lost jobs over things other people might have survived. A changed schedule. A question about her mother. A manager asking for a real phone number. Something old would rise in her, hot and humiliating, and before anyone could decide she was not worth keeping, Ruby would leave. Leaving first felt like control. Then Tom Larkin hired her at the laundromat. Tom was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with gray hair and a limp from a mining accident. His laundromat sat between a pawn shop and a closed video rental store. The front windows were cloudy from dryer heat. The lights buzzed. The change machine jammed if you hit it too hard. It was not much, but it was steady. Tom needed someone to open in the mornings, wipe machines, fold laundry, and keep the back room from turning into a storage cave. He did not ask Ruby to explain herself on the first day. He showed her where the mop was, which washers leaked, and which customers paid late but always paid. For the first time in months, Ruby had a key to something. Not a home. Not a family. Just a metal door under a flickering sign. Still, she liked turning that key before sunrise. She liked the quiet before the machines started. She liked sorting clothes into piles that made sense. Whites, darks, towels, work shirts, baby blankets. Other people brought their mess in baskets, and Ruby helped make it clean again. There was comfort in that. For a few weeks, she did well. She came early. She kept the dryers lint-free. Tom began giving her more hours. Then he said that if she wanted to stay on properly, they had to make the job official. He needed her full name. Social security number. Current address. Past work history if she had it. Nothing about his voice was cruel. Ruby heard danger anyway. Address meant the house near the tracks. Work history meant all the jobs she had left before they could leave her. Full name meant records. Records meant someone could write her down the wrong way and make that version permanent. She said she had lost her social security card. That might have been true. Then she gave Mavis's old address. That was not. Tom nodded and said they would sort it out. But he needed the right information eventually. His patience made Ruby feel trapped. Anger she knew what to do with. Patience made her feel as if she had already disappointed someone. Over the next week, she began to ruin the thing she wanted. She arrived late. She snapped at a customer. She told Tom Darlene was in the hospital, then forgot, and said the next day her mother had worked a double shift. Tom noticed. He waited until the laundromat emptied, then asked her to sit in the back room. "Ruby," he said, "I'm not trying to get you in trouble, but I can't help you if I don't know what's real." For one moment, she could have told him enough. Not everything, just enough. She could have said her papers were a mess, that home was a mess, that she was scared of being judged before she could prove she was useful. Tom was not offering rescue. He was offering a legal job, regular hours, and a chance to fix one piece of her life. Ruby wanted that. Wanting made her feel weak. So she chose the door. Her face hardened. She told Tom he sounded like every other man in town who thought poor girls owed him their whole story. She said he could keep his job. She said she did not need him looking through her life like she was something on a shelf. Tom did not yell. That made it worse. The bell over the laundromat door rang softly when Ruby walked out. She kept going until she reached the corner, then looked back through the steamed window. Tom was still in the back room, one hand on his hip, the other rubbing his forehead. He looked disappointed. Ruby hated him for that. Disappointment meant he had expected something better. By nightfall, she had changed the story. Tom had been nosy. Tom had been waiting to fire her. Tom had wanted to make her feel small. By the next week, she believed most of it. That was how Ruby survived, losing the things she ruined. She renamed shame until it sounded like betrayal. Linda Harlan remembered children by where they sat on the bus. After 28 years driving the same county roads, she could still picture them. The loud ones in the back, the sick ones near the front, the children who waited until everyone else got off before standing, as if the last seconds on the bus were safer than whatever waited at home. Ruby Clay had been one of those children. Linda remembered the oversized coat, the guarded eyes, the way Ruby watched houses through the window but never seemed eager to reach her own. Back then, Linda had been only the bus driver. She could ask if a child was all right. She could report what troubled her. She could not take a child home just because her heart said something was wrong. Years later, Linda saw Ruby outside Miller's grocery. Ruby was 21 by then, though she looked worn in a way that made age hard to guess. Her jacket was too thin for the mountain wind. She stood near the payphone, pretending she was waiting for someone, but Linda knew the difference between waiting and having nowhere to go. "Ruby Clay?" Linda asked. Ruby turned as if her name had been thrown at her. For a second, Linda saw the girl from the bus again. Then Ruby's face closed. "Do I know you?" "You used to ride my route," Linda said. "Briar Creek Line. I'm Linda Harlan." Ruby looked away first. "I remember." Linda did not offer pity. That was one reason Ruby did not run. Pity made her feel watched. Linda only asked if she had eaten. Ruby said yes too quickly. Linda pretended to believe her and bought 2 coffees and a sandwich anyway. That was how it began, not with a rescue. Just an old woman and a young woman sitting in a parked car while the wind pushed carts across the lot. Linda talked about small things. Ruby answered in pieces. She was not ready to be known. Linda did not force it. A week later, Linda found her again behind the laundromat after dark. Ruby said she had a place to stay. Linda looked at the plastic bag, the tired set of her shoulders, and the way she kept rubbing her hands together for warmth. "I've got a spare room," Linda said, "just for a few nights." Ruby almost said no. No was safer. No kept the debt from forming. But it was cold, and Ruby was tired of being strong in places that did not care whether she survived the night. So she went. Linda's house sat at the end of Briar Creek Road, white paint peeling near the porch rail, yellow light in the kitchen window. It was small, but it had the kind of order Ruby associated with other people's lives. Shoes by the door. A basket of mail on the counter. Photographs on the wall. Blue met her first. He was a mixed-breed dog with cloudy eyes and a gray muzzle, moving slowly but with great seriousness. Ruby froze when he approached. Blue sniffed her shoes, her bag, her hand. Then he leaned his weight against her leg. Something in Ruby weakened. She did not cry. But she lowered one hand onto Blue's head and let it stay there longer than she meant to. Linda saw that and said nothing. The spare room was small. A narrow bed. A dresser with 2 empty drawers. Clean sheets with faded blue flowers. On the chair, Linda had placed 2 towels, still warm from the dryer. Ruby stood in the doorway, as if crossing into the room might make it disappear. "You can put your things wherever you like," Linda said. "My things aren't much. Then they won't take long." It was the kind of answer that did not shame her. The first night, Ruby slept with her bag beside the bed. The second, she put it in the closet but left the door open. By the fourth, she folded her shirts into one of the drawers. It felt almost reckless. Drawers belonged to people who expected to stay. Linda gave her simple expectations. Help with dishes. Let her know if she would be out late. Do not bring trouble to the house. Tell the truth before a problem got bigger than it had to be. Ruby nodded at all of it. She even meant to try. For a while, she did. She helped Linda pull weeds from the flower bed. She carried groceries. She sat with Blue on the porch while Linda watched the evening news. Linda's granddaughter, Grace, came after school some afternoons, a serious 9-year-old who accepted Ruby's short answers as if they were enough. "Are you Grandma's friend?" Grace asked once. Ruby looked toward the kitchen. "I don't know what I am." Grace handed Ruby a crayon from the coloring book between them. "You can be that until you know." It was such a child's answer that Ruby had no defense against it. Those were the days that should have saved her. Not because they fixed what had been broken. No spare room could undo Cedar Hollow, Darlene's locked bathroom door, Mavis's wounded face, or every report that had gone nowhere. But Linda's house gave Ruby something she had rarely had. A pause between what had happened to her and what she might still choose. Then Mark Harlan came by. He was Linda's only son, a broad-shouldered man who worked for the county road crew and carried worry like a second job. He loved his mother in practical ways, fixing porch steps, checking smoke detectors, bringing Grace over with groceries. Mark was polite to Ruby. That was all. Polite, not warm. Watchful, not cruel. He asked where she was working, how long she planned to stay, and whether she had anyone helping her get back on her feet. Linda frowned at him. Ruby smiled without showing teeth. She had known men who used questions as traps. Mark's questions were not traps exactly, but Ruby felt the old alarm anyway. He saw too much. Or maybe he only saw what Linda did not want to see. After he left, Linda told Ruby not to mind him. "He worries about me." Ruby said she understood. But understanding did not stop the fear. Because Mark belonged to Linda in a way Ruby never could. He had childhood photographs on the wall. He had a key that needed no explanation. He could question Ruby because he had a place in that house no one would ever ask him to earn. That night, Ruby lay awake in the spare room, listening to Blue breathe at the foot of the bed. For the first time in years, she was warm, fed, and wanted. And already, part of her was preparing for the day someone took it back. For almost 3 months, Ruby lived in Linda Harlan's house without knowing what to call it. It was not exactly home. She did not trust that word. Home had been too many rooms where she learned to listen before breathing, too many kitchens where promises died before breakfast. But Linda's house was not temporary, in the way motel rooms were temporary. It had routines. It had a place for her coat. It had a drawer where her socks stayed folded even when she was not looking at them. Chaos asked nothing but survival. Kindness asked Ruby to become someone who could receive it without turning it into suspicion. Linda tried to make that possible in small ways. She did not push Ruby for a full confession of every missing year. She only gave Ruby ordinary tasks and treated them like trust. Take Grace to the bus stop. Bring Blue inside if it rained. Lock the back door before bed. Ruby liked being useful. Usefulness felt safer than love. If Linda needed her, maybe Linda would not change her mind. On Wednesday nights, Linda sometimes went to Church Orient. She did not pressure Ruby to come. Cedar Hollow churches were full of people who remembered too much, and Ruby had no interest in sitting under stained glass while women whispered over casseroles. But one night, Linda forgot her reading glasses and asked Ruby to bring them from the kitchen table before Pastor Eli Warren arrived to drive her. Ruby found the glasses beside a stack of old envelopes. One envelope had her name on it, not Ruby's handwriting, not Linda's. A county office stamp marked the corner, faded but still readable. Ruby should have left it alone. She knew that. Privacy was one of the rules Linda had never needed to say out loud. But her name had always been something other people wrote down before she knew what version of her they were keeping. She opened it. Inside was not a full file. Just copies. Notes. A dated intake form from years earlier. A line about a bus driver reporting concerns. A child reluctant to go home. Possible neglect. Follow-up recommended. Ruby stood at the table until the room seemed to tilt. A bus driver. Linda. The sound of Pastor Eli's truck came through the window. Ruby shoved the papers back into the envelope, but not neatly enough. She carried the glasses to the porch, handed them to Linda, and watched the older woman smile like nothing had changed. For Linda, maybe nothing had. For Ruby, the past had just reached out of a drawer and put its hand around her throat. That night, while Linda was gone, Ruby sat on the bedroom floor with Blue's head against her knee and replayed the dates. She had been 9, maybe 10. Old enough to remember sitting behind Linda on the bus, staring at the road, hoping the ride would last longer. Old enough to remember stepping down onto gravel while Linda watched from the mirror. Linda had known. That was the sentence Ruby could not move past. Not Linda had tried. Not Linda had called someone. Not Linda had been one woman inside a system built to lose children in paperwork. Only this. Linda had known, and Ruby had still gone home. The next morning, Linda noticed the change. Ruby answered too quickly, smiled too late, moved through the kitchen with a careful politeness that had no warmth in it. When Linda asked if something was wrong, Ruby said she was fine. Fine was one of the first lies Ruby had ever learned. Linda did not press. That made Ruby angrier. A part of her wanted Linda to ask harder, to force the envelope into the open. Another part of Ruby knew that if Linda explained, the explanation might make sense. Ruby did not want sense. Sense would take away the clean shape of betrayal. Over the next week, Ruby began collecting small injuries and making them mean more than they did. Linda forgot to save her the last biscuit, and Ruby heard, "You are not family." Mark came by to fix the porch rail, and Ruby heard, "He is taking the house back from you." Grace ran first to her grandmother after school, and Ruby heard, "You are only borrowed." None of those things were fair. Ruby knew that in brief flashes. She knew Linda had fed her, housed her, trusted her with Grace, let Blue sleep outside her door. She knew a phone call years ago was not the same as abandoning a child, but knowing something and surviving the feeling of it were not the same. The old wound wanted a face. Linda was close enough to become one. Mark noticed before Linda admitted it. He came over one Saturday with Grace and found Ruby on the porch, watching Linda in the garden with a look he did not like. "You okay?" he asked. Ruby smiled. "You always ask people questions like you're already writing down the answer?" Mark did not smile back. "Only when something feels off around my mother." There it was. My mother. Not Linda. Not the woman who had made space for Ruby. His mother. His blood. His right. Ruby looked toward the garden, where Linda was kneeling beside marigolds. Blue slept in the shade. "She tells you everything?" Ruby asked. Mark's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing." But it was not nothing. It was the beginning of a new kind of lie. One that did not invent a whole story so much as bend the air around the truth. Ruby did not tell Linda that Mark had threatened her. She did not need to. She only became quiet after his visits. She only let Linda find her wiping her eyes once. She only said, "I know he doesn't want me here," then refused to explain. Linda was tired enough, and kind enough, to worry. That worry gave Ruby something she had not felt in years. Power. Not loud power. A softer, sadder power. The power to make someone prove they cared. The power to make Linda choose, even if Ruby never said the choice out loud. It should have frightened her. Instead, it steadied her. The more guilty Linda looked, the less abandoned Ruby felt. If Linda felt responsible, maybe Linda would not ask too many questions. If Linda thought Mark was being harsh, maybe Ruby could stay. If Ruby stayed close to Grace and Blue, if she helped with dishes, if she looked wounded at the right moment, maybe the house would hold. She told herself she was only protecting what Linda had given her. But that was not the whole truth. Ruby was beginning to punish Linda for failing to save the child Linda had once seen in the bus mirror. And the terrible thing was that Linda did not yet understand she was being punished. She only knew Ruby seemed hurt. So Linda tried to love her more carefully. That made everything worse. Because every gentle thing Linda did now carried two meanings in Ruby's mind. One meaning was simple: an old woman trying to care for a young woman she had found broken and cold. The other was darker: too late, too late, too late. By the end of that month, Ruby no longer saw the spare room as a gift. She saw it as evidence. Proof that Linda had always had room somewhere in her life, just not when Ruby had needed it most. That thought was cruel. It was also incomplete, but Ruby held on to it because it turned pain into accusation. And accusation was easier to carry than grief. After Ruby found the envelope, Linda's house changed without moving an inch. Blue slept by the porch door, and Grace still left crayons on the kitchen table. But Ruby no longer entered those rooms as a guest trying to be grateful. She entered them like someone studying weak places in a wall. At first, even Ruby would not have called it manipulation. That word sounded too deliberate, too close to what the prosecutor would one day say in court. Ruby told herself she was only protecting the room Linda had given her. But protection can become possession when fear does the thinking. Ruby began to measure Linda's moods. If Linda seemed cheerful after Mark visited, Ruby grew quiet. If Linda mentioned Grace spending the weekend, Ruby offered to help, then acted hurt when Mark said he could handle his own daughter. If Mark asked a question at dinner, Ruby answered politely, then spent the evening washing dishes with her shoulders tense enough for Linda to notice. She did not have to accuse him directly. A direct lie could be challenged. A wounded silence made Linda fill in the blanks herself. One Sunday afternoon, Mark found Ruby on the porch with Grace, helping the girl braid a friendship bracelet. Grace was laughing because Ruby had tied one knot wrong and called it a design choice. For a moment, Mark almost softened. Then he saw Ruby's purse open near the step. Inside it, partly covered by a scarf, was an ID card with a name that was not Ruby Clay. He waited until Grace went inside. "What name is that?" he asked. Ruby looked down, then back at him. "Too fast. Old work thing." "That's not what I asked. You don't get to ask me everything." "I do when my mother has you living under her roof." There it was again. His mother. His roof by blood, even if the deed had Linda's name on it. Ruby felt shame rise, then anger came to rescue it. "You think I'm using her," Ruby said. Mark did not answer quickly enough. That silence was answer enough. Later, when Linda asked why things felt tense after Mark left, Ruby gave her a smaller version. She said Mark had seen something in her bag and acted like she was stealing. She said he made her feel like trash. She did not say he had asked about the false name. Linda's face tightened. "Mark can be protective," she said. Ruby nodded as if trying to be generous. "I know. I just wish he didn't look at me like I'm some kind of threat." The sentence landed exactly where Ruby wanted it to. Linda's guilt did the rest. That night, Linda knocked on Ruby's door with a folded blanket she did not need and apologized for Mark being hard on her. Ruby accepted with wet eyes and a soft voice. A part of her felt sick. Another part felt safe. The lie worked, not because Linda was foolish, but because Linda was kind and already carrying an old guilt she had never fully named. Ruby had found the bruise in Linda's conscience and learned how to press it. From then on, Mark's visits became tests. Ruby would be helpful before he arrived and wounded after he left. She would let Grace cling to her, then step away when Mark entered the room. She would tell Linda not to worry, then make worrying impossible. Mark saw it happening. He just could not prove the shape of it. "You need to slow this down," he told Linda one evening while Ruby stood in the hallway, unseen but listening. "You don't know what she's brought into this house." Linda's voice was tired. "She's been brought enough things by other people. That doesn't mean she can't hurt you." Ruby closed her eyes. There were two ways to hear that sentence. The honest way. Mark was afraid for his mother. The way Ruby chose. Mark had already decided she was poison. When Linda found her in the hallway, Ruby only looked at her with pain that asked to be comforted before it asked to be understood. "I can leave," Ruby whispered. She did not mean it. Not fully. But she knew Linda would say no. And Linda did. "No, honey. We'll figure this out." Honey. The word should have warmed her. Instead, it gave Ruby more to lose. Mark kept digging. He found calls from an old motel manager, a debt Ruby had not mentioned, and a woman from the laundromat who remembered Ruby leaving after a dispute over paperwork. None of it made Ruby a monster, but it made her story less clean than the one Linda had been trying to believe. Mark did not take it to the police. He brought it to Linda. That mattered. Later, Ruby would forget that part because it did not fit the version she needed. Mark did not try to destroy her first. He tried to warn his mother. Linda waited until Grace had gone home and Blue had settled by the stove. Then she asked Ruby to sit at the kitchen table. The table was where Linda had fed her, where Grace had colored, where Ruby had once watched steam rise from a bowl of soup and thought, almost unwillingly, I am safe. Now the table felt like a witness stand. Linda placed her hands flat on the wood. Ruby, she said, is there anything you need to tell me before this gets bigger than it has to be? There it was. Not an accusation. A door. Ruby knew it. She heard the tremble in Linda's voice. Linda was not asking because she wanted to throw Ruby out. She was asking because she still believed confession could save something. Ruby could have told enough. About the false name, the debt, the envelope, the way she had been making Mark look crueler than he was because she needed Linda to choose her. She could have said, I found the papers. She could have asked, why didn't anyone come? One honest question might have changed the shape of everything that followed. But honesty would have cost her the room before she knew whether mercy would replace it. So Ruby lied. She looked at the woman who had washed her sheets, fed her, trusted her with Grace, and let Blue sleep outside her door. Then she said, no, I swear. Linda watched her for a long moment. Ruby felt the lie sitting between them like something alive. For once, she did not feel clever. She felt 9 years old again, waiting to see whether the adult in front of her would believe the version that kept her alive. Linda wanted to believe her. That was the tragedy. She did not believe completely. Something in her face had changed by the time she stood from the table. But she wanted to. And Ruby used that wanting the way a drowning person uses anything that floats, even if it drags someone else under. After Linda went to bed, Ruby sat alone in the kitchen. Blue limped in and rested his chin on her knee. For a few seconds, Ruby put her hand on his head and almost broke. She almost walked down the hall, knocked on Linda's door, and admitted the lie had come out because fear moved faster than courage. But then she imagined Mark's face when he found out he had been right. Linda taking back the key. Grace asking why Ruby did not live there anymore. The shame rose again. By morning, she had convinced herself Linda had forced the lie out of her by making the truth unsafe. That was not true. But it was useful. Mark did not come back to Linda's house angry. That was what Ruby hated most. Anger would have made him easier to turn into the villain she needed. If Mark had shouted, slammed a door, or called her what she feared she was, Ruby could have wrapped herself in injury and let Linda comfort her again. But Mark arrived on a gray afternoon with a folder under one arm and Grace's backpack in the other. He kissed his mother, told Grace to finish her homework, and asked if they could all talk after dinner. All. Not just Linda. Dinner was quiet. Linda made chicken and green beans. Grace talked about a spelling test. Blue slept near the stove. Ruby cut her food into pieces small enough to swallow without tasting. After Grace went into the living room, Mark opened the folder. He did not spread the pages across the table like a prosecutor. He did not enjoy what he had found. There were calls to old employers, a hidden debt, the name on the ID card, a motel manager who remembered another story. Nothing that made Ruby beyond saving. Enough to prove that the life she had given Linda was not the whole life. Linda looked older with every page. Ruby watched her face and felt fear sharpen into resentment. Mark's voice stayed low. Mom, this can't keep going like this. Ruby laughed once. It came out dry and wrong. So this is where you finally get what you wanted. Mark looked at her. What I wanted was for my mother not to get hurt. You think I came here to hurt her? I think you came here hurt, he said. And I think that doesn't mean everybody around you is safe. The sentence was not cruel. That made it harder to survive. Linda put one hand over her mouth. She was not looking at Mark now. She was looking at Ruby. Honey, Linda said, why didn't you tell me? Ruby could have answered with the truth. Because I was afraid. Because if you knew everything, I thought you would take the room back. Because I found the envelope, and I have been punishing you for a wound you did not make alone. The words rose in her throat, but shame rose faster. So she chose the version that hurt less to say. Because nobody really wants the truth from me, Ruby said. They just want a reason to leave. Linda flinched. Mark closed the folder. There's a place in Beckley, women's transitional housing. Pastor Warren knows someone there. You could stay while you get your papers straightened out. Mom can still help, but not like this. Not under the same roof. Not with Grace here. Grace. There it was. The child Ruby had colored with walked to the bus stop and help search for lost crayons. The child who had never asked for Ruby's records or history. Ruby looked toward the living room. Grace was humming softly over her homework. For one brief moment, Ruby understood. Not through the old filter of rejection. She understood clearly that Mark was protecting his daughter. Linda was trying to protect everyone. The house had rules because love without boundaries could become dangerous. That moment could have saved what was left. Ruby could have taken the phone number. She could have gone to Beckley furious but alive, ashamed but not unforgivable. She could have let Linda visit. She could have written Grace a letter later and told the truth in pieces small enough not to crush the child. But the room upstairs had already become more than a room. It had become proof. Proof that someone had made space for her. Proof that she had not imagined being wanted. Proof that for a little while, her clothes had belonged in a drawer, and her name had belonged in the house. Leaving that room felt to Ruby like agreeing it had never been hers. Transitional housing, she repeated. That's a nice way to say shelter. Linda shook her head. It's a way to keep you safe. No, Ruby said. It's a way to get me out without feeling guilty. Mark stood. That's not fair. Ruby turned on him. You don't get to talk to me about fair. You were born into this house. You didn't have to earn the key. The kitchen went still. Linda's eyes filled, but she did not cry. Ruby, I gave you that key because I trusted you. Ruby heard the past tense before she heard anything else. Trusted, not trust. The word landed like a door closing. Blue woke and lifted his head. Grace appeared in the doorway, holding a pencil, looking from one adult face to another. Is Ruby leaving? She asked. No one answered quickly enough. That silence did more damage than any answer could have. Ruby saw Linda hesitate, saw Mark move slightly in front of his daughter, saw Grace's face change as she understood that something had been decided without her. It was the old feeling again. Adults talking over a child's life. Bags packed, rooms emptied. A place that felt almost safe becoming temporary after all. Only this time, Ruby was not a child. That was the part she refused to hold. Instead, she reached for the easier pain. Betrayal. Rejection. Proof that Linda had chosen blood over the girl she had once brought in from the cold. Ruby walked upstairs and shut the bedroom door. She did not pack. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the drawers Linda had cleared for her. A few shirts. Socks folded badly. The purple sweater, Grace said, made her look less sad. Such small things. Such dangerous things to love. Blue scratched once at the door. Ruby let him in. He came slowly, pressed his gray muzzle against her knee, and sighed as if the whole house had tired him out. That almost undid her. Almost. Ruby put both hands over her face. She wanted to go downstairs. She wanted to say she was scared, that she had lied, that she did not know how to leave without feeling erased. She wanted Linda to say the room had mattered. But wanting had never made Ruby gentle. It made her desperate. By midnight, she had stopped thinking about Beckley. She had stopped thinking about papers, shelters, apologies, or any future that required her to walk out quietly. She thought about Mark being right, Linda being disappointed, Grace learning to be afraid of her. The key on her dresser no longer looked like a gift. It looked like something being taken back, and Ruby, who had spent her whole life preparing for doors to close, began to imagine what it would feel like to close one herself. Morning came without making anything clearer. Ruby woke in Linda's spare room with the key still on the dresser and Blue asleep against the door. For a few seconds, before memory returned, the house sounded normal. Pipes ticking in the walls, Linda moving carefully in the kitchen, a cabinet opening, coffee being poured. Then Ruby remembered Beckley. Transitional housing, not under the same roof, not with Grace here. The words had settled inside her overnight and hardened into something darker than fear. By breakfast, Ruby no longer heard Mark's proposal as a boundary. She heard it as a verdict. Linda had made oatmeal. She set a bowl in front of Ruby the way she had done so many mornings before. The gesture should have softened something. Instead, it made Ruby feel mocked. How could Linda still feed her like family while preparing to send her away like a problem? Linda sat across from her, hands wrapped around a mug. Ruby, she said, we need to talk about today. Ruby stared at the bowl. I'm not going to Beckley. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Nobody is trying to punish you. That's what people say when they want to feel clean. The words hurt Linda. Ruby saw that. She saw it clearly enough to stop. She did not stop. Linda's voice trembled, but she kept it low. I should have asked more questions sooner. I know that, but I will not pretend nothing is wrong just because I care about you. Care. Ruby almost laughed. That word had become unbearable. Mark arrived before noon. Grace was not with him. That alone told Ruby something had shifted. He stepped into the kitchen and kept his distance, as if the room itself needed careful handling. "Where's Grace?" Ruby asked. "With a friend," Mark said. Ruby nodded slowly. "So now, I'm not safe around her." "No one said that. You didn't have to." Linda stood between them, small and exhausted. "Ruby, please." For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, wind moved through the bare trees along Briar Creek Road. Blue came in from the hallway and lowered himself near Linda's chair. The ordinary sadness of that old dog made the room feel even smaller. Mark placed a paper on the table. A phone number. An address. A name. Proof that the offer was real. "You don't have to decide your whole life today," he said. "But you do have to leave this house for now." For now. Ruby heard forever. She looked at Linda. "Is that what you want?" Linda's face broke a little. "What I want is for none of this to be happening." "That's not an answer." "I want you safe," Linda said. "And I want my family safe, too." My family. It was not cruel. It was not even unfair. But it put Ruby outside the circle in a way no explanation could repair. Something old opened in her then. Not a memory exactly. More like every old room at once. The school office, Mavis's doorway, Tom's back room, the bus steps, the house near the tracks, adults speaking gently while deciding she could not stay. Ruby stood. Linda stood too. "Don't walk out like this." Ruby turned on her. "You already walked me out. You just found a nicer way to say it." Mark moved closer. "That's enough." Ruby looked at him and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You've been waiting to say that since the day I got here. I've been waiting for you to stop lying to my mother." The sentence landed cleanly. Too cleanly. Because it was true. Ruby felt it pass through her defenses before she could twist it. She had lied. She had used Linda's guilt. She had made Mark into the enemy because it was easier than admitting he had seen something real. For 1 second, truth stood in the room with all of them. Then Linda said the word that broke whatever chance remained. "I am afraid of what you might do," she whispered. "Ruby, you're dangerous like this." Dangerous. The room disappeared. Ruby was no longer 21 in a kitchen with a woman who had tried to help her. She was 9 in a hallway, 12 in Mavis's room, 16 in a back office. She was every version of herself that had ever been named before being understood. Dangerous. Not hurt, not scared, not cornered. Dangerous. Linda reached for her, then stopped herself. That small hesitation did more than the word. It told Ruby Linda believed it. And some part of Ruby, the last clear part, knew Linda had reason. That was the moment that mattered. Not the word alone, not Mark's warning, not Beckley, not the envelope. All of it had led there, but none of it forced what came next. Ruby still had a body that could move toward the door. She still had feet that could carry her down the porch steps. She still had a key she could leave on the table and a life that, however broken, had not yet crossed the final line. Blue lifted his head. From somewhere outside, a car passed slowly on Briar Creek Road. The world gave Ruby ordinary sounds to hold on to. She let them go. What happened after that would be told later in fragments, because no decent person in Cedar Hollow wanted to repeat the details. Neighbors would remember raised voices, then a silence that felt wrong. They would remember police lights washing the White House red and blue after dark. They would remember Mark's truck in the drive, Linda's porch light still burning, and Grace being brought back too late to understand why adults would not let her inside. 2 people were gone. Blue was gone too. Grace lived, but childhood did not return to her in the same shape. And Ruby Clay, who had once believed the world had made her into a thing no one could love, had finally chosen an act that made love impossible to defend. By nightfall, Cedar Hollow had a story it would tell for years. But the truth was worse than the story. Ruby had not snapped because one woman called her dangerous. She had been given a door, a key, a room, a dog that trusted her, a child who welcomed her, and an old woman who tried too late, but tried honestly. And when the last door was still open enough for Ruby to leave, she chose to make sure no one inside that house would ever feel safe again. By the time Ruby Clay returned to the courtroom for sentencing, Cedar Hollow had already decided what kind of story it wanted. It wanted a monster. That was easier than remembering the child in the oversized coat, the closed file, the bus mirror, and the adults who had seen pieces of the truth but never held them long enough to save her. A monster needed no explanation. A monster let the town sleep. But the courtroom could not afford a story that simple, and it could not afford mercy so wide that it erased Linda Harlan. The benches were full again. Mark's co-workers sat near the back, hats folded in their hands. Women from Linda's church filled one row. Pastor Eli Warren stared at the floor as if prayer had become too heavy to lift. Grace was not there. Her family had decided she had already carried too much. Instead, a victim advocate read her statement. Grace did not write about revenge. She wrote about being afraid of hallways now, about how she could not hear a dog bark without thinking of Blue, about how people kept telling her she was brave. But brave did not mean she got to be 9 years old again. Ruby listened with her eyes down. No one knew whether shame, grief, or self-pity held her there. Maybe all three. Maybe none in the right measure. Her face had become difficult to read, and Cedar Hollow had learned to mistrust everything about her that looked like sorrow. The prosecutor stood first. He did not describe what happened inside Linda's house. The law already had its record. The families already had their wounds. Instead, he spoke of trust. A woman who opened her door, a son who tried to protect his mother, and a child who survived a night no child should have had to understand. This case is not about whether Ruby Clay suffered, he said. The evidence shows that she did. But suffering is not permission. Pain is not innocence. And a hard childhood does not give anyone the right to turn a home into a place of fear. Ruby's public defender rose after him. His voice was tired, not theatrical. He spoke of Darlene's instability, reports that went nowhere, and a girl who learned too early that the truth was only useful when adults wanted to hear it. He asked the court to see the whole life, not to excuse the crime, but to understand how far back the damage ran. The judge let him finish. Then the room became very still. On the evidence table lay a small plastic bag containing the key Linda had once given Ruby. It was not dramatic, just a house key on a plain ring. But it seemed to hold more weight than anything else in the room. Ruby looked at it once. Maybe she understood then. Maybe she understood that the key had never been proof of a trap. It had been proof of a chance. Linda had not handed Ruby a debt or a test she was meant to fail. She had handed her the ordinary dignity of coming home. And Ruby had turned that dignity into grief. The judge spoke slowly. He said the court had considered Ruby's childhood. He said no decent society should ignore what happens to children who are not believed, not protected, and not followed through the cracks. But Linda Harlan had also been part of that society, and she had tried, imperfectly but honestly, to do what others had not. He said Mark Harlan had not been Ruby's enemy. He had been a son and a father, trying to set a boundary before danger became irreversible. He said Grace Harlan's survival was not a lesser tragedy, simply because she was still breathing. When the judge asked whether she wanted to speak, Ruby stood. The room braced itself for an excuse. For a long moment, she gave them nothing. Then she said, "Linda should have let me go." It was not clear whether she meant years ago, when Linda first worried about the girl on her bus, or later, when the spare room became too much for Ruby to bear. It was not an apology, it was a sentence full of grief and blame, and even then Ruby could not separate the two cleanly. The judge did not answer her. He sentenced Ruby Clay to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no gasp, no celebration. Justice did not make the room whole. It only named the price of what could no longer be repaired. In the months that followed, Linda's house on Briar Creek Road changed in small ways. The porch light was replaced. The flower beds went wild for a season, then someone from the church cleaned them out. The spare room was emptied. The sheets with faded blue flowers were washed, folded, and put away. Grace grew older. That was the kindest and cruelest thing time did. It moved her forward without returning what had been taken. She learned that a quiet house was not always safe, but it could become safe again with people patient enough to understand why she checked locks twice. Ruby became a name in prison records, old articles, and town warnings. Linda remained something else, a woman who had made room. Mark remained a man who had seen danger before anyone wanted to say its name. Blue remained, in the memory of those who loved that house, the old dog who trusted too easily because no one had taught him not to. And Ruby remained the hardest truth of all. She had been a child, nobody protected well enough. She had also become a woman who knew, more than once, that she could choose differently. The tragedy began long before Linda Harlan opened her door. But it became unforgivable when Ruby chose to destroy the people standing inside it.